The Meatshower. The mostly true tale of an odd and somewhat edible occurrence. Written by Mick Sullivan. Illustrations by Shae Goodlett. The Past and the Curious is a podcast by Mick Sullivan. And Mick Sullivan is my friend who plays the banjo. So, I'm going to read this book to you. It's just a fact. Sometimes strange things happen. And you're most certainly going to think this story is strange, but it's as tale as true as the leaves in the trees. Why, it's as real as this very jar on this very shelf, the same one I call home. So this is a jar that's holding a piece of meat. And it's the piece of meat telling the story today. Maybe you've heard about that famous tsunami of Sticky, the Great Molasses Disaster as it's known. That was unusual but easy to explain. A giant storage tank exploded and sent a tidal wave of gooey brown sweetness slowly creeping through the streets of Boston. Or there was the time that a giant flock of birds just plumb fell right out of the sky with nothing more than a thunder of thuds on the ground. Some folks call that one the Louisiana blackbird tragedy. Believe it or not, something similar has happened with frogs, or so I've heard. But if you're really looking for something strange, I'll tell you, there's nothing quite like what happened in the little town of Olympia Springs, Kentucky, one March day in 1876. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, but it's the reason I'm here, so I'm going to tell you anyway. Mrs. Crouch was gathering supplies to make a batch of soap. It was a hot, smelly job, so she typically worked in the yard, and the weather seemed to be perfect for her task. And this is Olympia Springs, Kentucky. And this is a little piece of meat sitting in a rocking chair telling you the story. Thunk, 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 thunk. Before she opened the door, she heard a sound from the roof above her. At first she thought it was a spring shower, but it didn't sound quite like the rain that she had heard before. It fell at odd times, not the steady, gentle pity-pat of a shower's first raindrops. It was a heavy, flat sound, a soft thunk against her old tin roof. Out the window, she saw nothing unusual. Then she heard a few more thunks. Stepping outside, she looked around to see what could be making such a strange sound. As she looked up, she felt it. It smacked her face with a sloppy slap and slid slimy and slow down the soft skin on the side of her face. She caught her breath and then broke the silence with a shriek. Yeah. Her husband, kindly Mr. Crouch, came running from the barn as she screamed. I got hit in the face with a piece of meat. As matter of fact as someone can be in such a peculiar situation, her dear husband calmly replied with a smile, I know, there's meat falling all over the place. It's a meat shower. A meat shower, she screamed. There's no such thing. Meat doesn't fall from the sky. Now that is most generally true. Meat does not normally fall from the sky. But that day, Mrs. Crouch was wrong. On the 3rd day of March in 1876, in the little town of Olympia Springs, meat did fall from the sky. Before long, the neighbors gathered on the Crouch's porch, confused and excited. A few carried umbrellas. Someone was toting a shovel. Another had a rake. That looks like a lot fell to me. Ben was the last to arrive, excited, hungry, and ready to make the best of the shower. Pointing with pride to the pail in his hand, he exclaimed, "Look, it's almost full of meat rain. Guess what's for dinner tonight?" This idea horrified Mrs. Crouch. "Ben, I think that's a terrible idea. You shouldn't eat meat that fell out of the sky. You don't even know what it is or where it came from. What if it makes you sick?" "Please," she begged, "empty that pail of meat." She was probably right, but Ben saved a little just in case it was delicious. Like all normal showers, this strange meat shower eventually came to an end. Now, perplexed by the strange chunks scattered about, the people of Olympia Springs set out to solve the mystery, but they would not be alone. The next morning, newspapers from the Carolinas to California ran the story. No one had ever heard of such a bizarre happening. It was the talk of the nation, and before long the place was crawling with scientists, meteorologists, and butchers. Everyone was hungry for an explanation to the mysterious meat from the sky. Specimens were packed up and sent to labs all over the country, while in Olympia Springs people guessed and gossiped and waited for an answer. One scientist said it was horse meat. I guess he thought a horse just up and exploded, shooting meat all over the place. Can you imagine? Not likely if you ask me, and besides, no one in town reported missing any horses. Another scientist speculated that the meat shower was the product of a kettle of vultures, which is the name for a flock of vultures in flight. In this hypothesis, a big group of those birds had just feasted on a giant meal, and then when they started to fly, one of them realized he had eaten too much. If he was going to stay in the air, he had to, well, get rid of some of that meat. And here's the thing about vultures: if one of them barfs, they all barf. So that's one explanation, perhaps. In the end, Mrs. Crouch and the townspeople never heard an explanation that satisfied them. While the scientific specimens disappeared and most of the remains were thrown away or eaten by Ben, the town wondered, waited, and watched the skies, hoping another meat shower would leave better evidence. After a while, life went back to normal. The meat shower remained a point of pride in Olympia Springs, Kentucky, but people everywhere else soon forgot about that strange, unexplainable day. Not me. I can't think of anything else. Of course, today, Mr. and Mrs. Crouch, Hungry Ben, and all the curious townsfolk are a distant memory, but I'm still here. I remember hitting the ground, surrounded by all the others, but I don't have the foggiest memory of what happened before that. All I can do is wonder as I stew in a dusty old jar on a museum shelf. Once I was in newspapers from California to Carolina, but to the few who even notice me today, I'm little more than a curiosity. They squint their eyes and wrinkle their noses before they move on. Maybe meat will never fall from the sky again, but I still pray someone curious and clever is struck by that distant, fateful March day and is hungry to solve my mystery. Where there is a mystery, there is hope, and as you've already clearly seen, anything can happen. So do me a favor and check the weather for tomorrow. I wonder if it's going to rain. In the notes in the back, There's one remaining sample of this meat, which is preserved in a jar at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. There are no reports of it actually talking. So, that's the Meatshower, written by my friend Mick Sullivan. He has a podcast called The Past and the Curious, and it's a good podcast for kids to listen to. And he probably has a podcast that talks about this a little bit more. And maybe you can even see him reading the book. I'm not sure. I haven't checked it out yet, but I'm going to.